The room went completely silent. Not the polite kind of silence. Not the kind where people pause to think. This was the silence of 23 people watching a billion-dollar deal die in real time, and not one of them knowing how to stop it. Ellsworth Beauregard Kane, 67 years old, pressed his palms flat against the marble conference table and watched the most important investor his company had ever courted walk toward the elevator without looking back. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. And Ellsworth, the man who had mopped these very floors for 11 years before anyone in that room had learned his name, was the only one who knew exactly what had just gone wrong. Let's go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start in that boardroom. It starts in a parking garage in Charlotte, North Carolina, at 6:15 in the morning, with a man named Ellsworth Beauregard Kane pulling a gray maintenance uniform over his shoulders and wondering if his knees were going to hold out until lunch. He was 67. He had the kind of face that told you he had lived, not in the romantic sense, but in the real sense. The deep lines, the careful eyes, the way he moved through a room like he was measuring it, like he had learned a long time ago that the less space you took up, the less likely someone was to make your life difficult. He had been a maintenance technician at the Alderton Grand Hotel for 11 years. Before that, 14 years as an international trade analyst at a mid-size consulting firm in Baltimore. Before that, 2 graduate degrees, one in economics, one in East Asian studies, both from Johns Hopkins, and a decade of work that took him to Tokyo, Shanghai, Taipei, and back again. Then the layoffs came. The industry shifted. He was 52, and his field had been swallowed by algorithms and cheaper labor overseas. And the irony of that particular cruelty was not lost on him. He had spent his career studying global trade, and global trade had eaten him alive. He tried. For 2 years he tried. Sent out resumes, got interviews, watched the eyes of HR managers travel from his resume to his face and back again, that half-second flicker of recalculation that he had learned to recognize, and then came the emails. We've decided to move in a different direction. He got 61 of those emails in 22 months. Eventually, the savings ran out. His daughter Rosette, 26 at the time, and 3 months pregnant with his first grandchild, offered to let him stay with her and her husband. He stayed for 4 months. Then he found the maintenance job at the Alderton Grand. Entry level, $41,000 a year. He took it without negotiating. He told himself it was temporary. 11 years later, he was still there. But here is what most people at the Alderton Grand did not know about Ellsworth Beauregard Kane. He had never stopped learning. Every morning at 5 a.m., before his shift, he sat at the small kitchen table in his studio apartment on Beattisford Road, and he studied. He had always studied Mandarin. Back from his consulting days, he was conversational, functional, professional level in the specific dialect of business. But over 11 years of early mornings and late nights, he had gone far past conversational. He had read contracts in Mandarin. He had read legal briefs, trade agreements, financial disclosures, not because he expected to use it, just because it was the one thing that still belonged entirely to him, the one thing nobody could take away or lay off or restructure. He had one friend who knew this about him. Her name was Josephine, Joe, the hotel's director of housekeeping operations, a no-nonsense woman from Mississippi who had worked at the Alderton Grand longer than anyone else still employed there. Joe knew because she had once walked in on Ellsworth during his break, headphones in, reading a dense Mandarin financial document on his phone, and she had stopped in the doorway and said, "Ellsworth, what on earth are you doing?" And he had looked up and said calmly, keeping sharp. Joe had laughed. Then she had not laughed. Then she had sat down and said, "You know, you're too smart for this place." And Ellsworth had said, "Most places don't know what they've got until they need it." He had been right. He just hadn't known how right he was, or how soon. The Alderton Grand was 3 weeks into the most important business negotiation in its history. The ownership group, 5 partners, all of them white, all of them in their 40s, all of them very confident in a way that well-funded people often are, had been in talks with a major Chinese investment firm based in Shenzhen. The lead partner was a man named Vincent Zhao, Chief Acquisition Officer for Meridian Pacific Capital. Meridian was prepared to invest $1.1 billion into a hotel development project across 4 American cities. The Alderton Grands ownership group, led by a man named Stafford Price, had secured the first meeting, the second meeting, and what everyone believed would be the closing meeting. The closing meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in October. Meridian's team flew in from San Francisco. Stafford Price had 2 attorneys present, a CFO, a VP of acquisitions, a marketing director, and an assistant who had been awake for 36 hours preparing the presentation. What Stafford Price did not have was anyone who spoke Mandarin. This had never come up as a problem before, because Vincent Zhao's team had always communicated in English and brought their own interpreter. But the interpreter, a woman named Linda Chen who had worked with Meridian Pacific for 6 years, had tested positive for the flu 2 days earlier. The replacement interpreter they hired flew in from Atlanta and was, it turned out, a Cantonese speaker whose Mandarin was shaky at best and who had no background whatsoever in financial or legal terminology. The meeting started at 10 a.m. By 10:40, there was a problem. The ownership group's attorneys had drafted a revision to the governance clause, Section 14, subsection C, that defined operational control rights during the 18-month post-acquisition transition period. In English, the clause read one way, but the Mandarin translation that had been prepared and distributed to Meridian's team, translated by the same Atlanta-based interpreter the previous week, read something significantly different. In the Mandarin version, the language around decision-making authority was ambiguous in a way that suggested Meridian would have less operational control than they had been promised. It was not intentional fraud. It was a translation error. But it was the kind of error that, in a room full of people who had flown 8 hours to be there, felt like something far worse. Vincent Zhao read the clause. Then he read it again. He asked his remaining staff members, 2 associates who spoke limited English, to confirm what they were reading. They confirmed it. He closed the folder in front of him. He said in English, measured and quiet, "This language does not reflect our agreement." Stafford Price's lead attorney said, "We're happy to clarify." Vincent Zhao said the clarification should have been in the document. There was a pause that lasted about 4 seconds. In that 4 seconds, Stafford Price watched $1.1 billion begin to evaporate. Zhao pushed back from the table and stood. He said a few words in Mandarin to his associates. Nobody in the room understood them. The interpreter started to say something and then appeared to decide against it. Zhao picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, buttoned it once and walked toward the elevator. The room did not move. Ellsworth had been on the 41st floor since 8 that morning, handling a work order for a malfunctioning HVAC vent 3 doors down from the conference room. He had finished the repair by 9:30 and was replacing the access panel when the conference room door opened and he heard down the hall the sound of a meeting falling apart. He recognized the cadence before he understood the words. He had been in enough high-stakes rooms to know what dissolution sounded like. He stood in the hallway with a screwdriver in his hand and watched Vincent Zhao's team come out first. Then he watched Zhao himself, moving at that particular pace of a man who has decided something and is not reconsidering it. Zhao passed him in the hallway without looking at him. Ellsworth looked at the screwdriver in his hand. He looked at the elevator doors. He looked back toward the conference room, where, through the glass, he could see Stafford Price standing with both hands pressed against the table and his attorney talking at him rapidly. Ellsworth thought about the morning in Baltimore when the layoffs were announced, and he had stood in the parking garage for 40 minutes, just standing there, unable to make himself get in the car. He thought about the 61 emails. He thought about the 4 months on his daughter Rosette's couch, listening through the thin wall to her and her husband argue in hushed voices about money and space. and how long this was going to go on. He thought about what it felt like to be invisible in rooms you once belonged to. Then he put the screwdriver in his belt, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the elevator. Zhao was standing in front of the doors, waiting. His two associates stood slightly behind him. Ellsworth stopped a few feet away. He said, in Mandarin, careful, precise, the Mandarin of a man who had spent 20 years learning to use it correctly. Excuse me, I believe there may have been a translation error in section 14. Zhao turned. He looked at Ellsworth. He looked at the uniform. He looked back at Ellsworth's face. He said, in Mandarin, I'm sorry. And Ellsworth said, the governance clause. Subsection C. In the English original, the decision-making authority is structured as a co-management arrangement with a defined review period. The Mandarin translation uses a phrase that implies subordinate advisory status. It's a distinction the translation didn't preserve. It's an error. I don't believe it was intentional. Silence. One of Zhao's associates said something fast under his breath. Zhao raised a hand slightly and the associates stopped. Zhao said, how do you know this? Ellsworth said, I read the clause, just now. Through the glass on the door, when you walked past. I recognized the language. He paused. I also have a copy of the English version from the initial distribution packet. I picked it up off the floor outside the conference room earlier this morning. Someone dropped it. He reached into the chest pocket of his uniform and produced 3 folded pages, the English draft of section 14. The one the housekeeping staff had been asked to keep clear of. He had found it at 7:58 a.m. near the recycling bin outside the service elevator. He had read it in the 4 minutes between finding it and starting his work order. Old habit. Zhao took the pages. He read them. He handed them to one of his associates, who read them and spoke quietly. Then Zhao turned back to Ellsworth and said in English, for the first time, who are you? Ellsworth said, my name is Ellsworth Kane. I'm a maintenance technician here. Zhao looked at him for a long moment, not the dismissive look, the other kind, the look that Ellsworth had not seen directed himself in a very long time, the kind where someone is actually calculating what they are seeing. Zhao said, you read Mandarin legal documents? Yes. At that level, yes. Why are you? Zhao stopped. He appeared to make a decision about whether to finish that sentence. He did not finish it. Instead, he said, would you be willing to come back into the room? What happened in the next 40 minutes, Stafford Price would later describe to 3 different journalists as the most surreal business meeting of my life. Ellsworth Beauregard Kane, 67 years old, maintenance uniform, screwdriver still on his belt, sat at the conference table between the 2 parties and went through section 14, subsection C. Line by line, in both languages, clarifying every point of ambiguity, flagging 2 additional phrases in subsections D and G that had similar translation inconsistencies, and answering 3 direct questions from Zhao's associates that required precise knowledge of how specific Mandarin legal constructions mapped onto American contract law. He did not perform. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply did what he had spent 20 years doing in the early morning hours of his studio apartment. He read carefully, translated accurately, and said exactly what the words meant. At one point, Stafford Price attorney started to speak, and Ellsworth said, quietly, excuse me, he's asking about the review timeline, not the control structure. Those are different questions. The attorney stopped. Zhao's associate looked at Ellsworth and nodded once. The revised section 14 was redrafted by hand on a notepad, in both languages, in the next 30 minutes. Ellsworth read both versions aloud when it was done. Zhao's team confirmed the Mandarin. Price's attorney confirmed the English. Both parties initialed the notepad pages, pending formal revision. Vincent Zhao shook Stafford Price's hand at the door. Then he turned and shook Ellsworth's hand. He said, in Mandarin, thank you, you are a careful man. Ellsworth said, I've had a lot of time to be careful. Joe was waiting in the maintenance corridor when Ellsworth came out. She had heard pieces of it from the service entrance. Not all of it, but enough. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, Ellsworth, Beauregard Kane. He said, Joe. She said, you just saved $1 billion deal in a maintenance uniform. He said, I saved it in a clean maintenance uniform. That matters. She laughed so hard she had to put her hand on the wall. Stafford Price did not immediately know what to do with what had just happened. He was not a bad man, that is worth saying clearly. He was the kind of man who moved quickly through the world, because the world had generally rewarded him for moving quickly, and in that speed he had missed things. Many things, and many people, without ever pausing long enough to realize what he had failed to see. He had worked in the same building as Ellsworth Kane for 3 years. He had walked past him on the 41st floor. He had never once asked his name. He stood in the empty conference room after everyone had left, and looked at the notepad on the table with its 2 columns of handwriting, English and Mandarin, and thought about the fact that the man who had saved his company from a catastrophic loss had been 3 doors down all morning with a screwdriver and a work order. His assistant, a young woman named Yvette, who had been in the meeting and had watched everything with careful eyes, appeared in the doorway. Stafford said, find out everything you can about Ellsworth Kane. Yvette said, I already did. She set a printed sheet on the table. Johns Hopkins. Masters in Economics. Masters in East Asian Studies. 14 years as a trade analyst. Publication in the Journal of International Business Studies in 2003 and again in 2007. He speaks Mandarin, Japanese, and some Korean. He's been working maintenance here since 2013. Stafford looked at the sheet. He said, why, Yvette said, 52 years old when he started applying again. The economy. And she stopped. And she said it plainly. And he's black, Stafford, and he was 52. Do the math. Stafford was quiet. 3 days later, Stafford Price called Ellsworth into his office on the 44th floor. Ellsworth had never been to the 44th floor. He sat in a leather chair across from a desk that cost more than his car and waited. Stafford said, I want to offer you a position. Ellsworth said, what kind of position? Senior International Liaison. You'd work directly with Meridian Pacific during the acquisition transition. 18 months minimum. Full salary. I'm thinking 140. With a review at 6 months. You'd have an office. An assistant. Ellsworth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 140 to start. Ellsworth looked at his hands. He thought about the studio apartment, the early mornings, the kitchen table at 5 a.m., reading legal documents in a language nobody around him understood, for no reason except that it still belonged to him. He said, can I ask you something? Stafford said, of course. Would you have hired me for this job in 2013, if I had walked in off the street with my resume? Stafford did not answer immediately. That was itself an answer. He said finally, I don't know. I'd like to think yes. But honestly, I don't know. Ellsworth appreciated that, more than he would have appreciated a lie. He said, I'll take the position. The formal signing of the Meridian Pacific acquisition agreement happened 6 weeks later, in the same 41st floor conference room. A professional interpreter was present. A very qualified woman flown in from New York. She was excellent at her job. But at one point, during the final review, Zhao's lead associate flagged a phrase in a supplemental exhibit. The interpreter translated it. Ellsworth, sitting quietly at the side of the table in a gray suit that his daughter Rosette had helped him pick out, said, just to confirm. She's right, but the context is a 2019 regulatory update that changed how that phrase is applied in cross-border acquisitions. You'll want to add a footnote. The room looked at him. Zhao's associate looked at the interpreter. The interpreter looked at Ellsworth. She said, he's correct. I wasn't going to go into the regulatory history. Zhao looked across the table at Ellsworth and said nothing. But there was something in his expression. A small, deliberate nod that said more than enough. Rosette drove up from Colombia the weekend after her father started his new position. She sat across from him at the kitchen table of the studio apartment he had not yet moved out of, because he was not entirely sure he was ready to believe it was real, and she looked at him for a long time. She said, Daddy. You should have had this 20 years ago. He said, maybe. She said, not maybe. He was quiet. He looked at the kitchen table, the same one he had sat at every morning at 5 a.m. for 11 years. The coffee ring in the corner, the scratch near the edge from the time he had dropped a textbook. He said, Rosette, you know what I learned in 11 years of early mornings? She waited. I learned that bitterness is expensive. You pay for it every day and you never stop paying, and it doesn't buy you a single thing. He paused. So I learned Mandarin instead, and I kept showing up, and eventually, the room needed what I had. Rosette looked at her father. Her father, who had slept on her couch for 4 months. Her father, who had worn a gray uniform for 11 years. Her father, who had read legal documents at 5 in the morning, when no one was watching and no one would have thought to ask. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. She said, the room needed what you had a long time ago. It just wasn't paying attention. I want to say something directly to you, right now, before you move on. There are Ellsworth canes everywhere. In every hotel, every office building, every loading dock, and school hallway and hospital corridor in this country. People who were handed less than they deserved and kept going anyway. People who kept learning in the dark. People who read legal documents at 5 in the morning, not because anyone was watching, but because that was the only way they knew how to hold on to who they were. The world moves fast and it overlooks people, and it does not stop to apologize. But what I want you to remember is this. Ellsworth did not wait for the world to change before he kept going. He kept going because he understood something most of us learn too late. That what you carry inside you cannot be laid off, cannot be restructured, cannot be replaced by an algorithm. He kept his skills sharp. He kept his dignity intact. He walked into that hallway with a screwdriver and 11 years of invisible mornings, and he changed the trajectory of something much larger than himself. The room was silent until he opened his mouth. And then nothing was the same.